Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's so nice to see you again at this very early hour. The world economy is in a highly fluid situation, and emerging economies in particular are in a much more volatile situation. This global situation certainly affects Korea. It has various ramifications and policy implications. This morning, we have Professor Son. I'm sure most of you know him well, but he will enlighten us with his insights on these global issues. Dr. Son is currently, as you know, teaching at the California State University as the Martin V. Smith Professor of Economics. He holds a chair there. But I must say, he is one of the most versatile practicing economists. He certainly is anything but armchair economist. He has had a long, successful career in U.S. banking industry. He was CEO of Hanil Bank, which was the commercial bank in LA. But before he took that position, he had a very successful career as Wells Fargo Banks, as executive vice president and chief economic officer. And also he served on the Council of Economic Advisors at White House and in the U.S. And also he served as a commissioner at the Port of Los Angeles. As you know, the Port of Los Angeles is the largest port in the U.S. And then he serves on various corporate boards. So he's very, very versatile and successful practicing economist, I would say. And then he has been recognized as one of the most outstanding economic forecaster. As you know, economic forecasting is really hazardous business, but he has been not only survived there, but he excelled there. And so Time Magazine and the Wall Street Journal in 2006 featured a story naming Dr. Son as the most accurate economist in the United States. And then in 2010, the Wall Street Journal named him as one of the 5 best forecasters in the country. It is a real honor for any economist. And then he ranked 3rd in 2012 as the most accurate economic forecaster. And then Bloomberg News selected him as one of the 5 most accurate forecaster in the United States. And so he has been fully recognized as the most outstanding economic forecaster. And then he teaches there, and he gives lectures and everywhere, and then he visits all over the world and give lectures and share his views on the global economic issues and financial issues. And he was with us a number of times before, So most of you know very well that we have the presence of press corps, and he's very popular among our press corps as well. So with no further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Song for sharing his insights with us. Please join me. Welcome.
Well, thank you, Dr. Sakong. He's not only, of course, very well respected here in Korea, but also he's very well known, and he's sought after in the United States as well. So it's a pleasure to see him once a year or so. One thing he didn't mention is I've got another job in addition to being a professor. I'll continue to be a professor, but recently I was appointed by the mayor of Los Angeles to manage $14.5 billion employee retirement funds. So that's a pretty big job. And also I'll be handling not only the $14.5 billion retirement fund, but also all the retiree insurance needs. And then so I'm really looking forward to it. And finally, I can help manage money rather than simply advising. So that I'm very excited about that. I'm going to give you my conclusions first. Today, most of my discussion will be about emerging markets in Korea. And I just got back. In fact, last night I flew in from China, and I spent 3 days in China discussing economic conditions in China and elsewhere. If you look at the conclusion around the world, the global economy is slowing. Every meeting I went to in China, they were talking about slow economic growth, efficient demand, and that seems to be the underlying theme. Also in China, as you know, deflation, disinflation is the problem. A couple of days ago, CPI, PPI numbers came out. CPI is approaching zero. They are very concerned about that, and they think that's because of a deficient demand. Not only CPI is approaching zero, but also PPI has been down for several years, declining, and they are very concerned about that. And to the end of my talk, I want to spend some time talking about the Korean economy. I know you spend a lot of time talking about the Korean economy, so you don't need to hear from me, but I think it's probably good for you to hear about an outsider's view of how Korean economy is unfolding. So I think that might add some benefits to the Korean economic outlook. As far as the Korean economy is concerned, my conclusion is that there are many things the government has and is and will do. But one of the things that I'd like to recommend again is for the Bank of Korea to cut the interest rate to zero as soon as possible, and then I will get into greater detail later on as to why I think the Bank of Korea should be cutting the interest rates not 0.25% at a time, but to zero as soon as possible for the Korean economy in the context of the global economic conditions that I'm talking about. What I'm saying is that when you have a slowing global economy and deflation, disinflation concerns in the world, Korea is really no exception. If you look at the global economy as an ocean, an economy such as Korea, New Zealand, or even Japan is like a boat, one ship, and you cannot really overcome the massive currents in the ocean. Therefore, you have to do what you can to stabilize your boat. And I'm saying that in case of Korea, one of the things that the government can do is for the Bank of Korea to cut interest rates to zero as soon as possible. I'll get to that, but let me first of all talk about the global economy first. DM means, of course, as you know, developed markets such as U.S., Korea, and well, Korea economy is a developed market. And so when you talk about the DMs, we are seeing gradual pickup. And if you exclude the U.S., there isn't really much economic growth to speak of. But when I talk about global gradual pickup in DMs, there are three reasons for that. Number one is obviously currency. The euro has depreciated quite a bit. The Japanese yen has depreciated because of their quantitative easing. And so currency depreciation against the dollar, that is a positive. We all know about the price of oil. That's like a tax cut. And that is helping many economies around the world. Also quantitative easing. And if you look at quantitative easing here, you see the black portion of the bar, which is European Central Bank. The red portion, that's the Bank of Japan. And blue portion, that is, of course, the U.S. Federal Reserve, and that has ended. Quantitative easing certainly has and then will continue to be an important part of a policy tool. And I think this is one of the reasons why DMs, developed markets, are coming out of an economic slump, even though it is not going up very rapidly. That's one of the reasons why, if you look at Europe, for example, in the euro area, the jobless rate has had gone up quite a bit, but it is beginning to edge down, and then we are moving in the positive direction. But if you look at the European economic situation, well, even though economy is doing better, there's really not a whole lot of excitement out there. This morning, my primary conversation with you is about the emerging markets, EM. The best way to put it is the tide is going out. Up until a couple of years ago, emerging markets was really the locomotive of pulling the global economy upward and forward, including China. That is no longer the case. People are concerned about emerging markets, and then it is having impact throughout the world, including Korea, United States, and Europe, and etc. When you look at the emerging market concerns, there are three key issues. China slowdown. Korea, for example, about 25% of its exports go to Korea and China, and they are slowing down. When you talk about the Chinese slowdown, that is having a global repercussions, and I'll talk more about that specifically later. And the other one is lower commodity prices. Many countries from Brazil, Indonesia, even Australia, Canada, they are suffering because China is not buying as much as they used to. And of course, we all know the central bank, the Federal Reserve in the U.S., they're about to hike the interest rate in December. Just to give you some numerical example of how important China is to the global economy, you see export exposure to China as a percent of GDP. In case of Korea, 10.3%, it is the highest. Malaysia, 8.6%. Chile, 7.1%. And you can see the, like for example, we have an ambassador from Indonesia, and then here, Indonesia, you can see it is about 2%, so it is considerably less than Korea or Malaysia, but still a very significant sum. When China's economy slows, it is going to have a global repercussions, and it's been the locomotive pulling the global economy forward and upward, but that is no longer the case. If you look at DMs, developed markets, also we are being adversely affected by economic slowdown in China. Germany, for example, about 11% of their exports, 11% of their GDP goes to China. The fastest growing market for Mercedes-Benz, the BMW, that's China. Not Korea, not the United States, but the fastest growing market. And the fastest growing market for golf clubs like Callaway, that is China. And then you can see the country from Germany, Italy, Japan, all these countries are beginning to feel the impact of an economic slowdown in China. So we're talking about why emerging markets are not what it used to be in terms of economic momentum. The other reason is, in addition to China, which I'll talk about more in a minute, commodity prices, and we all know commodity prices are trending that down. Again, this is again related to China not purchasing as much. And this is one of the reasons why, if you look at the currency values, I divided the currency, emerging market currencies into two categories, commodity EMs and then manufacturing EMs. And you can see, well, they are both depreciating and will continue to, but commodity DMs, the commodity EMs you can see is depreciating a lot faster and compared to the other countries. When you look at emerging markets, there's another reason. I talked about China, I talked about commodity prices, but also emerging markets have what economists call a new sin. What do we mean by a new sin? They've got a lot of debt. You can see corporate debt as a percent of GDP. If you add the government debt on top of that, then you're talking about a lot of debt. See, so emerging markets are suffering from a tremendous amount of debt. You can see it has about quadrupled in the last 10 years or so. Not only have they increased the amount of debt in total, what we call new sin, but also they ended up borrowing a lot of money overseas in US dollars, in Japanese yen, and euros. Why? Because interest rates were low. Not realizing that, well, their currencies could depreciate. And their currencies have depreciated, so emerging markets are having difficulty servicing the debt denominated in US dollars, Japanese yen, and then euros, and etc. So that's another problem. Well, no wonder, because of all the economic problems and some other concerns about the interest rates, capital is flowing out. That's true not only in emerging markets, but also in China as well. If you look at this blue bar going down, you can see net capital outflows in emerging markets. And that has begun, and that is obviously accelerating. And this is one of the concerns we have. When you talk about emerging market debt, what I call a new sin, well, in 2015 alone, we have seen capital outflow approaching about $1 trillion US. And by the end of this year, my estimate is that it will probably be about $1.25 trillion. Well, these countries, they have current account deficits. They need capital inflows, not outflows. But you can see there's a massive outflow, and this is one of the reasons why we are seeing economic problems in emerging markets, and their currencies are depreciating. As capital outflow continues, it's not surprising that foreign currency reserves are declining. Almost every emerging market nations, they are losing reserves. And the question is, how long will it go? Brazil is a very good example. As you know, Brazil, they are one of the main commodity exporters, like mineral exports. Here you see one of the biggest mines in northern Brazil. And if you look at Brazil, the price of iron ore that they sell has dropped tremendously. It used to be as high as $125 a ton. Today we are talking about $30 a ton, about one quarter of what they used to get. And so this is hurting Brazil's economy and cash flows. Current accounts, you can see, used to be massive positive when China was buying a lot of iron ore from Brazil. China is not buying as much, therefore now Brazil has a current account deficit. As you know, current account, that is simply an economist's jargon. It is a fancy term for cash flow. A nation's cash flow that is called a current account, and you can see Brazil is experiencing negative cash flows. Not only that, you see the Brazilian real in the last year. Brazilian currency has depreciated 60%, not 6%, but 60%. See? And why? In part because they're not selling as much to China. And in Brazil, on the other hand, because their currency has depreciated so much, that is a cause for inflation. Inflation is approaching double-digit rates. So economy is slowing, money is going out, current account deficits are very high, inflation is high. Well, in this situation, obviously, the central bank has to raise the interest rate. What Brazil needs is a low interest rate, not high interest rates, but the central bank has no choice. Money's leaving the country, so they're trying to protect their reserves. They are raising the interest rate. When you raise the interest rate, what happens? That slows economic growth even more. So they are kind of in a catch-22 situation. And even in the United States, we are seeing American exports to Brazil slowing. Napa Valley used to sell many bottles of wine to Brazil. Actually, that is falling, declining, see, okay? Same to Europe. But again, U.S. is suffering as well because China is not buying from Brazil. And because of that, Brazilian economic growth is slowing. And as a result of that, well, they're not buying California wine from the United States. So you can see it goes round and round and round. So far, I've said, a significant portion of the problems that we are facing in emerging markets is due to China. So that's one of the reasons why I went to China over the last 3 days, and I probably met about 20 economists and government officials, and then so I think I'm pretty up to date on what's happening in China. And then so let me talk about what's happening in China right now. Well, economy is slowing. I mean, we all know that. So this is really not a news. The question is, will this become a soft landing or hard landing? What is government doing about it? And again, what impact will this have to the global economy? The Chinese government has talked about reforms, economic reform, social reform, and even political reform. But all these reforms are hinged upon economy doing nicely. The Chinese government had a contract with the people. Essentially, they said, you know what? Leave politics to me, the Communist Party, and then you will live well. Economy will do well, there will be more jobs, so that let's just have a division of labor. And so that has worked out pretty well for the last 20 years or so. Well, that is beginning to become a bit shaky. Economic growth is slowing down. And then so the government cannot really continue on with the reforms that we talked about. And so clearly, the most important consideration as far as the Chinese government is to make sure that economic growth stabilizes, and maybe eventually they might be able to proceed with reforms, but not right now. So that's one of the concerns. We all know economic growth has fallen to 6.9% year over year in the third quarter, but many people, even in China, they are saying that this is a mirage. We don't have 6.9% economic growth. It is something much lower than that, see? And so that's what I've been hearing. Even in China, you see on the left-hand side, foreign exchange reserves, money's going out, see? And they are losing money. If you look at the right-hand side, you see the reason why. There's a capital outflows. So government is concerned. To be sure, China has lots of foreign exchange reserves, but if you lose money at this rate, even China, they are going to feel the impact. So they are saying, well, we ought to pay attention to that. Many people in the United States say, you know what, the China's economy really doesn't matter to us because we export so little. We export some food and we export some scrap metals and then used paper, but that's about it. Well, that is quite not true. You see, if China's economic growth falls by 1%, what impact does it have on your economy? You see, in Japan by 0.21%, in Eurozone 0.16%, in the U.S. 0.11%. Not a long time ago, 6-7 years ago, China's economy used to grow at 12 to 13% a year. It's been cut in half, and you multiply that by 0.11. You can see its impact on the U.S. economy. I argue that one of the reasons why the U.S. economy is slowing, not doing as well as we expected, is because of China. You see, it is shaving a significant portion of economic growth because of what is happening in China and other emerging markets and developed markets. So let me just give you why, people say, so why is the China's economy slowing so rapidly? And here's my theory, and then so when I was in China, I tested my theory, and then actually many people agreed with me, and so here's the reason. You see, in 2007, 2008, and 2009, we talk about quantitative easing in the U.S., Bank of Japan, and European Central Bank. Well, the most aggressive quantitative easing was from the People's Bank of China, right after around the financial crisis. They were concerned about economic slowdown, so they really created lots of liquidity. And so the question is, where did the money go? Well, as you know, in China, they built walls around the economy so money couldn't leave. And also, China has one of the highest savings rate. The savings rate in China is about 35% of GDP. And that's one of the reasons why consumption is not very high in China. So people save a lot of money. Where does the money go? Well, the money has to live and stay within China. And also Chinese corporations, local governments, they have borrowed lots of money. You see the debt to GDP ratio. In 2008, it was 80%. In 2014, last year, 300%. And this year, we estimate it to be about 325%. So I'm giving you three sources of liquidity. First of all, central bank, they engaged in massive quantitative easing, and then, no one called it quantitative easing, but it was, see? And the number two, people save a lot of money. And number three, they borrow a lot of money, not only from within the country, but from overseas as well. Where did all that liquidity go? Again, as I pointed out, the government built fences around the economy. Money couldn't leave the country. They had to stay in the country. The money went to real estate, money went to cement factories, money went to steel mills, and you see today they've got lots of excess capacity. You go to Shanghai, and from the Shanghai side across a river called, as you know, Pudong, and if you look at Pudong in the middle of the night, about half of the buildings are empty, see? There are no lights. Why? Because they had engaged in massive building, a lot of construction, but they're not selling. I'm sure you read about stories about the ghost cities in China, right? See? Even though those problems are beginning to be solved somewhat. The point I guess I'm making is that when you have all this excess liquidity, you are building things. When you build things, of course, what? Economic growth goes up, right? See? Now we are seeing the flip side of the coin, see? We had economic growth in steroids in China because of all that excess investments. But now they realize that there's too much capacity, too many cement factories, excess capacity in steel mills, too many condos that people cannot buy. Therefore, they're trying to slow down. When you slow down, what happens? Of course, economic growth slows, and that's what we are beginning to see. I'm saying that this is not a temporary phenomenon. This is going to continue on for a while, see? And of course, not only in real estate, but also old economy in China is slowing. Manufacturing, export-oriented, real estate. In all these old economy is slowing. Now, government wants the new economy, such as e-commerce, financial service, to take up the slack. But it is not taking up the slack fast enough. So old economy is slowing rapidly because of excess capacity. New economy is not picking up as rapidly. When you put the two together, you can see we have a significant economic slowdown. That's what's happening in China right now. And so if you look at the conference board, they are saying that between 2015 and 2019, economic growth will average 5.5%. In IMF, they are saying 6.6%, and then World Bank 7%. And then, well, in China, when I talk to some of the Chinese economists, I'm talking about Chinese economists, not foreign economists, they were saying that some of these numbers are too high. See? Some of these numbers are too high. So clearly, we have a problem. Now, the government really wants to rebalance the economy in China. As I mentioned in the past, much of economic growth came from so-called gross investments, building highways, condos, cement factories, steel mills I've talked about, right? But they want to change the mix of economic growth, and they call that rebalancing. They want household consumption to be going up. But you can see household consumption has begun to rise, but not as rapidly as the government wants. So here, once again, is kind of a transition problem. The government wants consumption to be rising rapidly enough to offset the slowdown in gross investments, but that is not what's happening. So that leads to economic slowdown in China. The key question, I guess, is are we going to have a hard landing or a soft landing? Well, China has two things that Korea doesn't, the United States doesn't. That is, the government has controls. Government can have what it wants. So the government can control almost anything and everything they want, see? So that's one. Number two, well, in the United States, fiscal policy there is really not an option because the government has so much debt. See? Now, Korea doesn't have a whole lot of debt, but still not as much as China. China has $4 trillion in reserves. They've got money, they've got controls. If they want soft landing, they shall have it, see? Okay? And then so I think the possibility of a hard landing that is out of the question. And also recently, as you know, they've been easing credit conditions. And then so one of the questions I guess people ask me, I'm a regular commentator in CCTV in America, so I go on TV on the CCTV, the Chinese Central TV. I'm a regular commentator, and then so people ask me all the time, the People's Bank of China has cut interest rates 6 times this year. Why isn't the Chinese economy perking up? See, well, they've cut interest rates, but if you look at what economists call monetary base, which eventually becomes the money supply, monetary base has been stable or been shrinking. See, and so if you look at the Chinese economic activities, it is in part being affected by the fact that monetary policy in recent months have been fairly tight. Even though in 2007, 8, and 9, as I pointed out, was very loose, but in recent months, it's been fairly tight. So that's one of the reasons why the People's Bank of China, they are trying to reverse that. Now let's talk about the United States. You can see, United States, we are seeing nice job gains, employment gains. And Janet Yellen, she likes that. By the way, just digressing for a minute, people ask me always, do you know Janet Yellen? And my answer is, I know Janet Yellen, of course, but I know her husband even better. And the reason is when I was a staff economist in the White House, George Eklof, Janet Yellen's husband, was my office mate. And then so in those days, Janet Yellen, she was just a staff economist at the Federal Reserve. So, we didn't pay much attention to her. And if I had known that she was going to become chairwoman of the Fed, I would have been much nicer, but it's too late. Anyway, she's doing a great job. But now, this is very important to Janet Yellen. I mean, I know Janet and then George pretty well. And so, they are Keynesian economists. And the Keynesian economists, they believe in something called the Phillips curve. Phillips curve is an economist jargon. It simply says when unemployment rate goes down, inflation rate goes up over time, see? And then so you see employment gains are rising. Economic activity is gaining some momentum in America. So sooner or later, that should be raising the inflation rate, but of course, that's not what's happening. So we're going to talk about that in a minute. But if you look at the labor market is tightening, and then this is number of workers available per job opening. As you can see, so labor market is tightening. And also, here I divided the U.S. job creation into 3 categories: high, medium, and low. And the red bars that you see, that is a high wage, and green, that is a low wage. And then you see the top, kind of the whatever color you call that, purple, I guess, that is a medium wage jobs. But more than half of the jobs that we are creating, they are red, which means high-paying jobs. So when you talk about economic growth in 2015, 2.5%. So, when I was a staff economist in the White House many years ago, one of my jobs was calculating potential GDP for the U.S. economy. And back then, I'm not going to tell you how many years ago, a long time ago, close to 100 years ago, we used 3.5%. Today, the potential GDP growth rate in the United States is about 2 to 2.5%. So you can see 2.5% actually we are, or slightly above the long-term potential economic growth rate. And then so the U.S. economy is mature and then it's not growing as rapidly as it used to. So Janet Yellen. The Federal Reserve, as you know, has 2 mandates, called the so-called the Humphrey-Hawkins law. And one is full employment, and the other one is price stability. Make sure you have a lot of jobs, and number 2, make sure inflation doesn't get out of control. Well, today, we're not concerned about inflation. We are concerned about deflation or disinflation. As I pointed out, my main concern about the global economy, including the U.S. and Korea, it's not inflation, but global deflation, global disinflation, see? And you see, if you look at the unemployment rate, the red one, that is going down. If you look at the black line, that's going up, that's employment. So the job market is going up reasonably well. But if you look at the CPI in the United States, services, they are moving sideways. They are not going up. Why? Because there's no foreign competition. On the other hand, when you talk about goods, from automobiles to shoes, there's import competition. Therefore, the prices are falling. And here you see kind of an interesting story. On the left-hand side, you see the goods. On the right-hand side, these are services, related services. So let's just look at the television. If you look at the price of television set in the United States over the last a few years, it has fallen by almost 58%. But if you try to buy cable and satellite services, it's gone up by 14% because that's services, right? If you look at the bottle of wine, if you try to buy a bottle of wine at a store, it's declined by almost 1%. If you try to buy a bottle of wine at a restaurant, that's services, it has gone up by 12%. If you look at men's suits, price went down by almost 4%. But if you try to dry clean, price has gone up by 9%. If you look at the household cleaning products like detergents, has remained fairly stable. But if you try to buy maid services, has gone up by almost 8%. And if you try to buy stationery that you write on, it declined by 1.4%. But if you try to buy postage, it's gone up by almost 20%. If you try to buy sports equipment like golf clubs and then basketballs, it's declined by 15%. But if you try to buy tickets to sporting events, it has gone up by 17%. So you can see, well, clearly we have a deflation on the goods side, but inflation on the service side. One of the questions I guess Janet Yellen, she faces is, why aren't wages going up? In the United States, about 65% of the CPI comes from wages. So if wages are not going up, as it is not right now, you're not going to have inflation. So that's one of the problems that she faces. And then, again, she believes, and her colleagues, that because of the Phillips curve that I've talked about, when jobless rate goes down, sooner or later, inflation rate will be going up. Well, that hasn't happened yet. But so hopefully that's what we're going to see. I think, again, my purpose in conversation this morning is not about the central bank, the Federal Reserve, but again, most people expect the Federal Reserve to hike the interest rates this December. You know, before the latest employment report, which is fairly strong, in the federal funds futures market on Wall Street, was a 50-50% chance, and now they are saying that there's about 70% chance that the central bank will raise the interest rate. Okay, and then so I think that's what's going to happen, and then there's, I think, almost a fait accompli. Now, the last item that I want to talk about this morning is the Korean situation. And again, I guess repeating what I said earlier, I know you hear a lot about the Korean economy. You certainly know more about the Korean economy than I do. But what I want to tell you is kind of an outsider's view of the Korean economy, and then I think hopefully that will be valuable. We all know the Korean economy has slowed for quite some time until the third quarter. In the third quarter, as you know, economic growth rebounded. So a lot of people are saying, aha, now the economy is rebounding, the new trend has been established. We can look forward to better, stronger Korean economy. Is this really the case? I guess my conclusion is really that is not the case. Again, I go back to the bigger picture. I mean, the Korean economy is important, but when you look at the global background, deflation, disinflation, in slowing economy, lack of demand in China, Europe, Japan, and etc., I don't think Korean economy will be an exception. So that this rebound that you see in the third quarter, that will be an aberration, not a continuing situation. If you break down the composition of the Korean economy, as you can see, especially in the third quarter, well, first of all, a significant portion of that was due to inventory buildup, and that is not necessarily good. See, unwanted inventories. Inventories are building because people are not buying as much. See, that's one of the concerns. And the other one is, of course, imports and exports. They're both going down, and in fact, exports are going down faster than imports, and that is not a good sign. And so that's a second concern that I have. And the third one, it's not a concern, but consumer spending is doing better, in part because of some of the government programs, but the special events that took place. So that the point is that when you adjust for all those changes, in the third quarter from a year ago, economy grew 2.6%. And when you take out, for example, inventory buildup, is only about 2%, which is not exactly very strong. You can see, as I mentioned, imports and exports are both going down, and that is really not a very good sign. And if you look at the exports by destination, exports to the United States, that is falling down more rapidly than EU, ASEAN, and then even China. And the other concern, of course, is the Korea CPI. And again, I talked about the difference between goods and services in the United States. And you really have a similar situation in Korea as well. Service prices are going up slightly. Goods prices are falling. You have a deflation. When you put the two together, you see overall. And they're kind of moving sideways. And again, lately it did go up slightly, but I think that is a short-term phenomenon. I firmly believe that Korea, too, is suffering from deflation, disinflation, and this is one of the reasons why, as I've said, the Bank of Korea should pay more attention to it. If you look at the composition of Korean CPI, you see, well, the alcohol and tobacco. In January of this year, the government raised the tobacco tax, and so that's one of the reasons that it went up, and then that's holding up the CPI. If you take that out, the Korean CPI is really not as high as what it is. And the last thing that I want to talk about, the Korean situation is, again, the Bank of Korea. And I've been talking about Bank of Korea on many occasions, but I'm going to do it again this morning. Again, my conclusion I'm going to give you first is that it should go to a zero interest rate as soon as possible. And here are some of the reasons people say, you know what, the Bank of Korea cannot lower the interest rate to zero as you want. In fact, they may or may not lower the interest rate. Right now it's 1.5%, that's their benchmark rate. By the end of the year, they may go to 1.25%, but that's about it. And then so I guess my explanation to that is, first of all, consumer spending is very important in any economy. In the United States, in Korea, consumer spending is very, very important. And consumer spending, with the exception of the third quarter, has been obviously pretty sluggish. And one of the reasons why the consumer spending has been very sluggish is because real interest rate is too high in Korea. Real interest rates, that is the difference between a nominal interest rate that you and I see every day, minus inflation. And because inflation rate is falling, real interest rate goes up. When real interest rate goes up, consumer spending, economic growth slows. What I'm saying is that we need to lower the real interest rate. How do you lower the real interest rate? Well, I'm saying that we need to reduce, in this case, of course, the nominal interest rates by the Bank of Korea. So that's one of the things that I'm saying. When you look at the Korea's consumer spending, that is about 65 to 70% of GDP. And also, when you look at the household debt in consumer in Korea, much of consumer debt is a floating rate. So if the Bank of Korea lowers the interest rate faster, that will have a positive, beneficial impact on the floating rate interest rates in the Korean economy. A related question people ask me is, you know, one of the reasons why the Bank of Korea cannot lower the interest rate is because the Korean households have too much debt. And well, I mean, you know, nominally that is true, but the other one is the Korea has one of the largest underground economy. If you look at the OECD explanations, Korea has one of the largest underground economies. So that probably the Korea's GDP is a lot higher and stronger than what the government statistics shows. So what I'm saying is that what you really need to look at is a debt to GDP ratio. If you look at the debt to GDP plus underground economy, really the ratio is not as high as what the Bank of Korea think it is. So I think that is another one. Also, the liquid assets, that's very important. If you look at the Korea's household balance sheet, in the United States, Americans, we, for example, have a lot of hard assets, which is not very liquid. But if you look at the Korean households' balance sheet and then look at the assets, they've got a lot of liquid assets, for example, bank deposits. So again, that's very important. The composition of assets. That is important in judging how much debt they can tolerate. So that's another point that I'd like to make. The other point, I guess, that people say is that, the Federal Reserve, they are raising the interest rate. The Federal Reserve is raising the interest rates. Why should the Bank of Korea lower the interest rates? I mean, wouldn't a lot of money leave the country? And I say, first of all, just because the U.S. Fed is raising the interest rate doesn't mean that the Bank of Korea has to either. When the Federal Reserve was engaged in quantitative easing a few years ago, Korea didn't engage in quantitative easing, so Korea doesn't have to follow the Federal Reserve. So that's one of the points that I like to make. And the other one is the concern about dollar outflows. There might be some dollar outflows, but I don't think it would be meaningful. It would be significant. Again, Korea is a very healthy economy, strong economy. People have a lot of confidence in the Korean economy. I don't think simply because the Bank of Korea brings down the interest rates to zero, we will see massive capital outflows, especially in the face of Federal Reserve raising the interest rate. So I don't think that's the case. And also, as you know, the Korean economy, the Korea has now foreign exchange reserves of over $300 billion. And what I say is that that's a lot of money. And one of the reasons why you save, one of the reasons why you save and I save, we all save, is because you want to be able to use the money during rainy days, right? And so I'm not talking about exhausting $400 billion in reserve, but we should be able to use some of that money to cushion ups and downs of shocks. Monetary policy is a blunt tool. I mean, true, it may adversely affect some sectors of the economy, but first things first. You want to make sure that the economy does better, economy can grow. There are many tools that is at disposal, but again, the quickest thing you can do in any economy, including Korea right now, is for the central bank to lower the interest rate, again, in this case, to zero. And I think that's one of the things that the Bank of Korea should do, and hopefully that will do, and then I think that will go a long way in stabilizing the Korean economy in this turbulent economic situation. So I'll stop here, and Dr. Sago, well.
Rundown of the global economy, and in doing so, he enlightened us on many issues and the many challenges, and particularly with regard to Korea, he made a very strong statement, which can be controversial. I'm sure there are people who disagree with some of the things you said, but certainly is one option, and we should consider, and we should, the monetary policymakers and the general economic policymakers should consider. And one of the things you haven't mentioned was on the structural adjustments and other the more intermediate to long-term policy tools. Korean governments is not doing enough, in my view, and the people are more concerned about our intermediate to long-term future, not just the cyclical the aspects of the Korean economy. But in any case, I'm sure you must have some questions and comments on his very illuminating and insightful presentation.
By the way, if I may just, you made a very good point. Yeah. Obviously, I focused on very short-term cyclical situation. Last year, I published a book in Korean. It was published here. And so last year when I was here, I did talk about it. Yeah. Actually, much of my book was devoted to longer-term structural factors, not short-term. Yeah. And one thing that I do want to point out is that in my book, I pointed out one of the best things any government can do is to dismantle government regulations. And that's true in the United States. And in fact, I pointed out in my book the cost in case of the U.S. And I urge the Korean government to do the same. Fortunately, I don't think it's because of me, but President Park Geun-hye, she has been holding meetings in Cheongwade Blue House with her ministers and trying to dismantle government regulations. And I think that certainly is one of the best things that we are seeing in the Korean economy.
I just hope that the government and presidential endeavor should be strengthened and continued. It shouldn't be just one-time event. It should be continuous, monthly, or maybe even weekly event. There's so many more things can be done, should be done. And, we have so much corporate reserve, but they don't invest much here, but they invest more abroad. So we should ask ourselves, why? What is the reason? Well, the business investment environment maybe not good enough compared to foreign the environment. So anyway, since he talked about current the economic cyclical situation, so he talked about mostly aggregate demand, but anyway, so this structural adjustments can be should be emphasized. And also this interest rate thing, today Monetary Board is meeting, and I think the outcome would be quite, again, as not surprising. But in any case, with this, please, any comments or the questions? No questions and comments?
While you were thinking about a question, again, I'm not trying to sell my book. It's kind of about a year old, but in my book I also talked about what they do in Israel and then how that could be applied to the Korean economy. And also in my book I talked about what I call the Wimbledon effect and how Korea should adopt that. Wimbledon is a tennis match in the UK, and it takes place once a year. But usually, a British never wins a Wimbledon match. Last year was an exception for the first time in 67 years. But almost always, a foreigner wins a Wimbledon match. So, as far as the British is concerned, what's important is not the fact that the British wins or loses the match, but the fact that it takes place on their soil in UK. They bring in a lot of talents from overseas, and then they get a lot of publicity, and then that's good for the country, UK in this case, and that is known as the Wimbledon effect. A good example of the Wimbledon effect is Silicon Valley. If you look at the people in Silicon Valley, about 40% of the talents in Silicon Valley, they are from overseas, China, Korea, India, and etc. If you go to UK, if you go to London, if you go to New York, the financial market, again, they've got Wimbledon effects. About 1/3 of the talents in financial districts in New York and London, they are from overseas, from India, again, Korea, and all those countries. And that's a kind of Wimbledon effect. And then so what I like to, again, point out once again is we don't really, unfortunately, that Korea does not have really what I call the Wimbledon effect. Foreigners coming into the United States have a very difficult time adjusting. My brother, here in Korea, he's retired now, but he has lived his entire life in Korea. He used to tell me, don't come to Korea and work because you will never make it because, you need the truth, you need the line. And then so that without that, it doesn't matter how competent and smart you are, you're not going to make it. So that, stay there, don't come back. And, to some extent that is true. Foreigners and even, I speak Korean, I understand the culture, I know a lot of people, and, probably my brother was and still is right. That is, it's very difficult, even for me, to be successful in Korea. So you can see someone else like, Switzerland, Indonesia, coming to, you're ambassadors, I know you have jobs, but the foreigners, they will not be successful. I shouldn't say not successful, but will have a more difficulty becoming successful because of this lack of a Wimbledon effect in Korea. But again, there are many things in my book that I talked about. The title of the book is called The New Economy. And
Yeah, okay. Any questions and comments? No, yeah, yes, please, yes. Microphone.
예, 저는 한 30년간 한국의 상공부, 현재 산업부죠. 거기서 근무했던 공무원인데요. 수출에 대해서 관심이 많습니다. 금리를 말씀하셨는데 오늘이 또 공교롭게 금통이 열리는 날이고 저는 한 달에 한 번씩 한국은행 총재 입장에서 항상 생각을 합니다. 금리를 올릴 거냐 말 거냐. 근데 운 좋게 최근에 하여튼 계속 맞췄습니다. 그래서 저는 오늘 그냥 평범한 경제에 관심을 가진 사람의 입장에서 오늘도 한국은행 총재께서는 금리를 올리지도 못하고 내리지도 못하고 눈치를 볼 것 같습니다. 그냥 동결할 것 같은데요. 심플한 질문 하나 드리고 싶습니다. 이제 미국 연준이 이제 금리를 올릴 것 같은데요. 금리를 올리면 이제 한국 경제 입장에서 굉장히 글로벌 경제에 맞물려 있기 때문에 일단은 국내 자본이 많이 유출될 것 같습니다. 하지만 금리를 올리면 환율이 우리 입장에서 유리하게 될 것 같습니다. 환율이 올라갈 것 같고. 그래서 이제 글로벌 경제에 맞물려 있는 한국 경제 입장에서 수출 입장에서 보면 상당히 좀 긍정적인 요인이 될 것 같습니다. 그래서 자본 유출하고 수출에 대한 어떤 긍정적인 효과 두 가지를 봤을 때 연준이 금리를 인상하면 한국 경제에 어떤 영향이 있을지 거기에 대해서 한번 말씀해 주시면 감사하겠습니다.
Yeah, his question is about the interest rate, both in the U.S. and in Korea. And we all know, we talked about the fact that it's highly likely that U.S. Federal Reserve will hike the interest rate this December 16th. Today, the Bank of Korea's FOMC is meeting, so my expectation is that they will keep interest rate stable at 1.5%, despite my advice this morning. And so the question is, what impact will it have on the Korean economy, especially the capital outflows and Korean exports? To be sure, capital outflows and then exports, that's very important. But again, my argument is that you cannot take care of everything. Monetary policy is a blunt tool. So first things first. The first thing, most important, is growing the Korean economy. And the Korean economy, despite a slight rebound in the third quarter, is suffering from the global disease that we have today, economic slowdown and deflation, disinflation. So I'm saying that first things first, we need to lower the interest rate to make sure that we help the Korean economy to get away from a slow economy and deflation. But again, I don't think that's what the Bank of Korea is going to do, so I am going to be disappointed later today. Your comment about what about capital outflow? I think there might be some capital outflow, but as I said, the global confidence in the Korean economy and Korean financial markets, that's very high. And I think that's important. The reason why the money is leaving Brazil is not because of the interest rate, that's a factor, but because the Brazilian economy is slowing rapidly. As I mentioned, the Brazilian currency has depreciated 60% over the last 12 months, okay? Primarily because investors don't have confidence in the Brazilian economy and policymaking. That is not the case in Korea. So there might be some capital outflows, but I think would be manageable. I don't think would be significant. Again, as I said, you save and I save. Why do we save? Because we want to be able to use it on rainy days, right? And same is true for the Korean economy. We have close to $400 billion in reserves. So, some of that goes out. That's not unusual. And then so you could lose 20, 30, 40, even $50 billion. And then eventually money will come back. So to me, that is really not a consideration. And then again, we should view really the reserves as a, cushion, shock absorber. As far as exports are concerned, clearly there are two factors which affects exports. Number one is what economists call income effect. When global economy slows, that means income effect is not positive, but it's not good. And so Korean exports are slowing primarily because China's not buying, and China's not buying primarily because their economy is slowing. See, so that economic slowdown globally, that is really the biggest problem. The second, I guess, determinant, which is important but less important than what economists call the income effect, is the price effect, which is the exchange rate. And if you look at the exchange rate, Korean won against the dollar has recent month has actually strengthened, and that's one of the reasons why import prices are falling. And then so again, I like to see the Korean won depreciate, and so that we could compete more effectively against the Japanese yen and then other countries. But again, I like to point out that we should not be cutting the interest rate primarily to depreciate the value of the Korean won. And then so what I'm saying is that if we lower the interest rate in Korea, one of the side effects is going to be depreciation of the Korean won, which will help Korean exports.
Yes, to ambassadors. Yes, ambassador.
Yeah.
Thank you. Well, first of all, Mr. Son, thank you for a very, very excellent presentation. I've been to many of the IGE forum. I think you are just the best. So
Thank you.
It's an excellent presentation. Now, at the beginning of your talks, you mentioned that you will be managing California pension funds with asset of $14 billion. I've been reading report by some economists with the repatriation of dollars back to the U.S. Now we are talking about, new bubble in Wall Street. And at the same time, there is going to be further repricing, in the financial market in Asia, because impending increase in the interest rate in the U.S. So, I think you must have a very tough job, managing, those pension funds. How are you going to diversify your portfolio, taking into account, all the uncertainties in the financial market in the world today?
Yes.
Ambassador.
Also, thank you very much, Dr. Sun. Maybe one observation with what you have said at the end with regard to depreciation of the Korean won, depreciation in general. I think many economies are thinking depreciation will help their economy. I think Switzerland is a country which has doing well all over the years, even though our currency has always appreciated very much. And I think that kept the Swiss economy running and competing all the times, and has given, I think, we believe, has given a lot of benefit instead of a depreciation. My remark is, my question is rather on the Chinese economy. I think we should not be so surprised that the Chinese economy has been slowing down, because the Chinese government has announced for many years they will rebalance their economy, and I think this kind of structural change has its cost, and the cost is in terms of lower growth during a certain period. My question is, how long will this period last until the structural adjustment is showing positive effect, and are we going back to higher growth rate in the future? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. First of all, the ambassador's question about the investments, I'll be managing that, help manage. I don't manage it myself, but I'll be the commissioner. I'll be a commissioner, and then I've got other people managing it for me. And I just was confirmed, in fact, a couple of days ago by the city council. So when I go back, I'll start a new job in addition to being a professor at the university. And, here we are managing money for long term. These are employee retirement funds. So my horizon is next 20 to 30 years. And when I look at the next 20 to 30 years, definitely there's more action overseas, in Korea, in Indonesia, and in Switzerland and other nations. Certainly, I believe emerging markets will grow faster, and there will be more opportunities to invest overseas. So my inclination is to gradually shift investments away from developed markets to emerging markets, but obviously, very slowly and gradually. I think that is one. And then so we set kind of a long-term what we call asset allocation, and then so it might be 70% in the U.S. and 30% overseas, and then over time that may go to 65% U.S. and then 35% to emerging markets like Indonesia. And Indonesia, by the way, is one of the countries that we invest in. And then, but in the short run, we have what is known as a tactical allocation to take advantage of short-term opportunities. And then so in this case, clearly the U.S. stock market has and is doing better, even though China has done, reasonably well recently. And then so that even though our long-term right now target is 70% U.S., we may actually increase it to 75% to take advantage of opportunities in the United States in the short run. So that's one thing that I'm sure I will be doing. The other thing I guess we want to be doing is, of course, industry emphasis. What areas? IT, that would be important. Healthcare, that would be important. And clearly, we want to move away from commodities and more old manufacturing. And as I mentioned, in China, they are doing the same thing. They are trying to de-emphasize the old economy, and they're trying to emphasize the new economy. But the problem, again, as I mentioned, the old economy is going down, but new economy is not coming out fast enough. So when you put the two together, you're having an economic slowdown. So to answer your question, I certainly am a fan of emerging markets. So hopefully, I have a 5-year term, and then hopefully in my 5-year term, I will be emphasizing emerging markets. The ambassador from Switzerland, I think it's very true. Swiss is a very good example. And, Swiss currency has been appreciating for quite some time, up until recently. And then so, but Swiss is a very good example. Despite the strong currency, the economy has done very well, and there are many reasons for that. But one of the reasons, of course, is the productivity gains. If you look at productivity gains in Switzerland, it has done very well. So same is true in Germany. German mark, not mark, the Germany, when they had a mark, a Deutsche Mark, and then now euro. The productivity gains have been one of the main factors of supporting the economy. But the answering Ambassador's question about this is the structural changes. How long will it take? The government, they really want to speed up the structural process, structural changes, in part because of the pressure from outside, from the U.S., from Switzerland, Indonesia, and all those countries. And then, they really want to do that. And in one area, they have made a significant progress in financial services. They have eliminated almost all the regulations on interest rates, both lending and then deposits. And they tore up a lot of barriers in the financial markets, and money can go in and out more freely. And shortly, I fully expect the IMF to include the RMB as one of the reserve currencies. So they have really done a wonderful job there, even though there's more to be done. But, there are other areas that they need to change, again, trying to encourage consumption. Also, they want to move more people from agricultural area to the cities. And then if you look at China, productivity in agriculture, they claim it is zero. When these people move from agriculture, where productivity growth is zero, to cities, the productivity gains will be even 2-3%, and that's going to add to economic growth. See, and so that's another key structural reform that they are working on. Again, the point, I guess, is that even though they do have all these reforms in mind. What's happening right now is that in the face of a significant economic slowdown, structural reforms has to be put on the back burner. So I think it's going to take much longer, whether that's 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, I don't know, but it will be longer than what you and I anticipated earlier.
Okay, thank you very much. We can keep Dr. Song here and discuss the more issues and the particular issues for Korean economy. But since we don't have enough time, we have to end soon. Again, as I said, Dr. Song had very quick rundown of current global economic situation, and mostly at the cyclical aspect. And so he didn't have enough time to talk about the structural adjustments part. But I think it's Korean economy's main challenge at this point, in my view, is more intermediate to long-term one. You mentioned the U.S. economic growth potential. The Korean real challenge is a too rapidly decreasing our economic growth potential. And again, in my view, there is room for improving the economic growth potential substantially. Of course, it's not easy to be done, but it can be done once the policy government has strong commitment and continued effort. It can be done. I say that is the key. Of course, we have very rapid aging and the shortening working hours and so forth. From labor side, of course, except the female labor market participation enhancement, there isn't much room, but there is still room for more the investment and more particularly in the productivity increase. In that regard, we have to do more the structural adjustment as market reform. And in particular, this labor market reform. You said we have reserve and the outsiders have much confidence in Korea and on a relative scale. But I think outsiders and investors, by the way, as you know very well, the stock market is more often than any other countries, more than 30% of shares are held by foreign investors. They are looking at the Korean economic situation. They are looking at what policymakers are doing. They are looking at what the government is doing. So labor market reform is one of the most important areas. So they will watch. So when the global economy is slowing and Chinese economy is adjusting, U.S. Fed interest rate is going up, and then they will have a closer look at the Korean economy. And so this all add up to what they will do eventually. So I think the Korean government should do both the Bank of Korea. I have a little bit cautious position on this Bank of Korea's interest rate policy, but I don't want to get into that. But one thing I want to say that Bank of Korea lost the time. They should have adjusted the interest rate much earlier, and while the global interest rate was going downward. So there is some points for the discussing whether this is the right time to go the other way so fast. Particularly this really household debt is the key. Again, I think the foreign investors will look at the household debt Korea. As household debt is the highest among OECD countries, and then this distribution is also a problem. And as the third quarter consumption went up, but because of this, the consumption tax reduction, and then the campaign. But without the expected income increase, I think the consumption increase would be very temporary. that will mean the next quarter on, it may be another factor to be consumption to be reduced, unless you have income the improvement. But that is the really the concern.
just,
Yeah, sure.
Make one
Yeah,
short comment about
sure.
the Bank of Korea.
Mhm.
The Bank of Korea has been cutting the interest rates like 0.25% at a time. And if you view the interest rate as a kind of ammunition, I argue that they've been wasting ammunition. When you lower the interest rate 0.25% at a time, it really has no impact. And so therefore, I'm saying that you are wasting ammunition. That's one of the reasons why I'm saying that if you want to cut the interest rates, what you need is a price factor. What makes monetary policy effective is the expectation or the surprise factor. And when you lower the interest rate from 1.5% to 0, that is going to be a surprise factor, not necessarily by 150 basis points, but let's say by 50 to 75 basis points. That will create the surprise factor and then move expectations and make monetary policy more effective. Let's look at the U.S. Federal Reserve. As you know, the U.S. Federal Reserve had a number of rounds of quantitative easing. Most economists, including myself, will agree that the first round was most effective, second, third were not. The reason was the surprise factor. We did not expect really the extent of quantitative easing in the first round, and we were surprised, and as a result, the economy responded, and then that really helped the U.S. economy. Second and third round, we expected it, everybody knew about it, it didn't really help very much. That's what's happening in Japan as well. When the central bank president Kuroda came in, first round was very effective. Since then, they've had more rounds, but it really has not been very effective. So what I'm saying is that what you need is really you need to move expectations, what I call the surprise factor. To do that, you cannot be lowering the interest rate by 0.25%, and you are wasting ammunition. You need to really move strongly, faster, dramatically to shock the people, shock the financial markets, and that's what you need. But we're not doing that in Korea.
Yes, okay. Well, I think Korean government and the Bank of Korea invite Dr. Song more frequently and then listen to you and have really serious discussions. In fact, I'm going to Europe next week. And while I'm in Europe, I will talk with Mike Spence, who is a 2006 Nobel laureate. Now, he's very, as I'm sure you are aware of this, but he is engaged in debate with Larry Summers. And the Mike Spence point is that what QE did was mostly did through financial channels, not the real economic channels. And then Lady Summers is saying that is, somehow you are degrading what QE has been done. And Lady Summers, in his blog, actually criticized Mike Spence. But Mike Spence is saying that, my point is that QE didn't work very well in real economy side, but more on financial side. So real investment was not affected much. But anyway, I don't want to get into that. But anyway, I will talk with him and then maybe feature the report later. But anyway, so there are different views on this short-term policies. But the bottom line I would like to make is that in Korea, of course, with this short-term management policy is very important. But at this point, we should put more emphasis on structural adjustments and the intermediate to long-term policy issues. Otherwise, even in the short term, foreign investors will look at whether Korea is really doing the right thing so that Korean economy will have a sustained growth in the future. But in any case, we should invite Dr. Song more often to Seoul and have our policymakers listen to Okay, please join me in thanking Dr. Son for his excellent presentation.